A 12-year-old boy went missing in South Carolina in 1960, and for decades, his case was filed as an unsolved cold case, with the vague assumption that he might have run away on his own. But this story is anything but that simple, because what happened in those brief few minutes that day set off a chain of events that lasted over 40 years, involving abduction, identity theft, and enforced silence. This was a child too young to decide his own fate, yet for a long time, many people believed he had gone somewhere or had no chance of survival. I personally disagree with that view, and in this video, I will explain why treating him as anything other than a victim is a dangerous mistake. This story is not just about a disappearance, it's also about stolen memories, justice that came too late, and how modern science has changed everything. Before we dive into this haunting true case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're interested in journeys to uncover truths buried for years, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. South Carolina, in 1960, was a land of small towns where time seemed to move more slowly than the rest of America, a social space run on routine trust and knowing everyone by face. Streets weren't crowded with cars, neighborhoods where doors were often left unlocked, children freely coming and going from one house to another, with rarely an adult accompanying them. In that setting, the idea of danger felt remote, especially for families who had lived in the same community for generations, where everyone believed they knew everyone, and a stranger would quickly stand out. The Evans family was a typical part of that picture. They lived in a small, tidy house not far from the town center, with a steady life free of major events or conflicts. Their days revolved around work, church, school, and familiar community activities. In that family, 12-year-old Matthew Evans was a true child of the South at that time, healthy, moderately active, used to getting around on his own in familiar areas, and trusted to be old enough to take responsibility for short distances. Matthew was not a rebellious kid, nor did he show any signs of emotional instability or family conflict. He was closely bonded with his relatives, especially the person who was with him that afternoon, the last witness to see Matthew before everything changed. Their relationship was built on absolute trust, the kind that was very common in families back then, where letting a child out of sight for a moment wasn't seen as a risk. It was within that space of trust that the first unusual detail appeared, not clear enough to cause immediate panic, but enough to later become an obsession. A person outside the family's circle of acquaintances, not completely unfamiliar in a way that would make someone avoid them, showed up in what seemed like a harmless context. The witness's initial reaction wasn't alarm, but hesitation, a fleeting doubt quickly brushed aside by very ordinary reasoning. Maybe it was just someone passing by. Maybe there was nothing to worry about. Maybe I'm overthinking it. The warning signs in hindsight were there, but at the time they were obscured by the long-standing sense of safety in the community. The moment Matthew vanished didn't come with a cry or major disturbance, but with a sudden absence in a very short span, just a few minutes enough to make everything irreversible. When the witness turned back, Matthew was no longer where he was supposed to be, and the first reflex wasn't fear but searching nearby, calling his name, reassuring oneself that the boy had just wandered off or gotten distracted close by. The family was quickly swept into a spontaneous search, checking familiar places, asking neighbors, gradually expanding the area, while unease grew with every passing minute. Panic didn't explode immediately, but built slowly, shifting from worry to fear as initial search efforts yielded nothing. By the point where denial was no longer possible, when Matthew still hadn't appeared, and no reasonable explanation held up, the Evans family had to face the worst possibility. The decision to report to the police was made in extreme distress, marking the moment the incident moved beyond a family matter and became an official missing person case, launching a chain of events that no one in that small town could have imagined in terms of how long it would drag on and its consequences. Immediately after the Evans family's decision to report to the police, the case shifted from a spontaneous search to the formal process of the local law enforcement agency. With the missing person report, recorded as an emergency situation involving a 12-year-old child disappearing without apparent cause. The night shift at the county sheriff's office immediately opened an initial file, gathering personal information, residence address, the last known sighting time, and preliminary details from the family in their highly stressed state. Urgency was evident from the very first actions, classifying the case as a juvenile missing person, activating the rapid response protocol available under 1960 conditions and capabilities, and requiring the presence of the last witness for an interview that same night to minimize memory fade over time. The main witness interview was conducted continuously, not just once but multiple times, with the goal of extracting every small detail from the period before Matthew vanished. From actions, standing position, direction of movement, to seemingly unimportant factors like surrounding sounds, pedestrian traffic, and the appearance of any individual not part of the known circle. Consistency and contradictions in the account were noted side by side, not to draw immediate conclusions, but as a basis for later cross-referencing as additional facts emerged. Meanwhile, the Evans family was asked to sit together and reconstruct the entire sequence of events that day, every small activity of Matthew from the morning, places he had been, people he had met, any minor changes in routine, to pinpoint the exact final cutoff in the boy's timeline. Based on these initial statements, investigators built a preliminary timeline, not conclusive but serving as a temporary framework, marking key moments from when Matthew left home, the last witness sighting, to the moment the family realized the prolonged absence was abnormal. The time gap between those points quickly became the focus, as it was the only window where anything could have happened, from a random accident to intentional human action. Alongside building the timeline, police narrowed down the disappearance area, based on a reasonable travel radius for a 12-year-old in a short time, combined with terrain, pathways, residential zones, vacant lots, and routes that could quickly lead out of the area. This narrowing wasn't meant to rule out possibilities early, but to create a realistic scope for subsequent investigative activities, preventing resources from being spread too thin while information was still limited. Factors like community habits, traffic density at the time of the incident, and Matthew's familiarity with areas within the radius were evaluated to prioritize search spots. During this process, investigators began forming initial hypotheses, not as conclusions, but as plausible scenarios to be tested in parallel. The possibility that Matthew left voluntarily was considered based on age, personality, and past behavior, while an accident was weighed against terrain and conditions. At the same time, third-party involvement, though lacking concrete evidence, wasn't dismissed, especially given the unexplained time gap and sudden disappearance without clear traces. Establishing these hypotheses allowed multiple approaches, preventing the team from locking into one explanation too early, when data was fragmented and emotions of those involved still heavily influenced perception. Throughout the activation phase, coordination between the family and police occurred in a mix of cooperation and tension, as every question and request to relive the final moments triggered guilt and fear from relatives. However, that very pressure also drove aggressive information gathering, because in the first hours, even the smallest detail could be life or death critical. As the night wore on and basic steps, report intake, witness interviews, timeline construction, and area narrowing were completed at a preliminary level, Matthew Evans's disappearance was officially shaped into an active investigation file, laying the groundwork for the next decisions by law enforcement, in the effort to uncover what really happened in that brief but fateful window of time. After Matthew Evans's missing person file was officially activated and the initial framework steps completed, investigators moved into the field examination phase, with the goal of turning scattered facts into a more concrete picture of what occurred in that critical short period. The area where Matthew was last seen became the focal point, systematically searched using 1960 methods and conditions, checking every entry's exit, hidden spaces, spots that could conceal a child's movement without drawing attention. The search wasn't limited to the exact disappearance point, but gradually expanded to adjacent areas based on reasonable travel radius, including trails, side paths, vacant lots, fences, sheds, and routes leading out of the residential zone. Each location was assessed for Matthew's access potential, his familiarity with it, and the possibility of another person approaching unnoticed. Alongside the search, investigators interviewed people present in the relevant time frame, from nearby residents, passers-by to individuals who only appeared briefly but might have seen or interacted with Matthew. Interviews were conducted chronologically, attempting to reconstruct the flow of events from multiple perspectives, not to find an immediate answer, but to gather as many information fragments as possible before memories were affected by time or external factors. In this process, small differences in accounts began to surface, not outright contradictions, but enough to flag points of note, such as inconsistencies in the exact time Matthew was seen, his precise position, or direction of movement. These weren't treated as evidence of lying from the start, but recorded as variables for cross-checking against other data, since investigators knew human memory, especially under stress, is often imperfect. From synthesizing statements and search results, the team began identifying likely paths Matthew could have taken during the disappearance window, mapping routes a 12-year-old might naturally choose, based on habits and environmental familiarity. These paths were ranked by plausibility, from frequently used routes to less traveled but easily accessible ones, while assessing whether Matthew could have left the area alone without obstacle. Meanwhile, third-party involvement was examined by analyzing areas allowing an adult quick access and exit, especially routes connecting directly to major roads. Identifying paths wasn't to confirm what happened immediately, but to create a hypothetical map of possible scenarios, guiding further steps. At the same time, initial hypotheses were updated and refined based on new information, eliminating or downgrading some scenarios, while prioritizing others. The voluntary departure possibility remained under consideration, but faced closer scrutiny when weighed against Matthew's personality, habits, and family ties, while accident likelihood was compared to terrain and search results showing no clear supporting signs. Conversely, factors involving a stranger's appearance and the hard-to-explain time gap began gaining more weight in evaluations, though still insufficient for any official conclusion. The entire initial investigation phase unfolded amid mounting time pressure, as investigators knew each passing hour reduced accurate information recovery chances and increased the risk of losing critical traces. Coordination among searching, interviewing, and preliminary data analysis aimed to keep the investigation from veering off course too soon, while ensuring all possibilities were considered in the phase with the most room for adjustment. As these first investigative steps gradually wrapped up, Matthew Evans's missing person file began taking the shape of a genuine investigation, with hypotheses built on more specific facts and an initial picture, still full of gaps, outlined clearly enough to direct law enforcement's next decisions. Once the initial investigative steps had established the on-the-ground scope and the possible directions of Matthew Evans's movements, the focus of the case shifted to its most urgent and resource-intensive phase, organizing a large-scale search with formal coordination between law enforcement and the local community. Based on assessments from the scene and the statements collected, the county sheriff decided to form a search party in line with the organizational capabilities of 1960, in which the police served as coordinators while local residents became the direct support force. The search teams were divided into small groups, each assigned to a specific area identified during the prior containment phase, with the goal of covering as much as possible of the places Matthew might have passed through or been taken to during the period he went missing. The initial search area focused on the vicinity of the disappearance site, but quickly expanded in concentric circles as no clear results emerged, encompassing small forests, abandoned farms, little-used trails, riverbanks, ponds, and open lands outside the direct line of sight of residential areas. The expansion was not haphazard, but based on a combination of investigative logic and the locals' practical knowledge of every path, fence, and overlooked spot in the town. Community participation was intense in the early days, as neighbors, friends of the Evans family, church members, and other residents voluntarily set aside their daily routines to join the search, driven by the belief that the more people involved, the greater the chance of finding Matthew alive. The search atmosphere was urgent, but also filled with interwoven anxiety and hope, as everyone believed that if they moved quickly enough and thoroughly enough, the boy might be somewhere waiting to be discovered. Throughout this process, the coordinating forces had to continually balance maintaining community morale with ensuring order, preventing spontaneous search activities from disturbing the scene or erasing important traces. Areas that had been checked were marked and recorded to avoid duplication, while harder-to-access locations were prioritized for groups with experience or good knowledge of the terrain. It was during this phase of expanded searching that the first personal items were discovered, not in shocking or obvious locations, but in places that made people pause and question how they ended up there. These discoveries were immediately reported to the coordinating forces, triggering careful inspections and documentation, because even though they were not conclusive, they served as important markers in efforts to determine the path Matthew had taken or been taken along. The appearance of these personal items both sparked hope that Matthew had been present in the area, and raised concerns that enough time had passed for other traces to be erased, making the search more difficult. At the same time, investigators continuously assessed the likelihood that Matthew was still alive, based on the aggregated data collected, including the time elapsed since disappearance, environmental conditions, locations of found items, and the community's response in the initial hours. These assessments were not publicly disclosed, but directly influenced resource allocation, from extending daytime searches into the night, to decisions on whether to further expand the scope or focus more deeply on specific areas. Each day without clear results altered the tone of the search campaign, as the initial urgency gradually gave way to fatigue and anxiety, while the Evans family had to watch familiar areas being scoured without yielding answers. Nevertheless, community mobilization was sustained for a considerable period, reflecting the shared belief that a large enough collective effort could compensate for the technological and logistical limitations of the era. The entire large-scale search phase became an inseparable part of the case, not only for what it might yield in terms of evidence, but also for its profound psychological impact on the family, the community, and the investigators themselves, as every step taken in the scoured areas was tied to the fragile hope that Matthew Evans was still somewhere, waiting to be found before time and silence closed another door. The prolonged silence from the scoured areas caused the case's focus to gradually shift away from physical spaces and into an increasingly complex flow of information coming from the very community involved in the search. Reports of sightings of a boy resembling Matthew Evans began appearing more frequently, originating from various sources and reflecting both the level of concern and the spreading anxiety in the town and surrounding areas. Some believed they had spotted Matthew on a familiar road, others claimed to have seen him near a store or at a public spot, and there were also reports from farther away, where similarities in build and age became the sole basis for believing the victim was still moving freely. Each such report was taken seriously, because in the context of a missing child, the line between a valuable lead and subjective misidentification is very thin, and overlooking one could mean losing a critical opportunity. However, the sheer volume of these reports quickly created a thick layer of noise enveloping the file, forcing investigators to implement a stricter process of verification and filtering to maintain the investigation's effectiveness. The reports were carefully cross-checked against the preliminary timeline, the initial disappearance location, and the realistic mobility of a 12-year-old child, given the terrain and infrastructure of the area. Through this cross-checking, many cases of mistaken identity gradually became clear, not because the informants were intentionally creating noise, but because human memory under stress is often influenced by emotions and the desire to find the victim. Inconsistent descriptions of appearance, differences in clothing, height, or direction of movement, meant these reports could not hold up when compared to confirmed facts. Alongside eliminating mistaken identifications, the investigation had to branch out into secondary directions arising from unverified information, from verifying routes leading out of town to checking locations where Matthew was said to have appeared after disappearing. Each secondary direction triggered a new chain of actions, requiring allocation of personnel and time for verification, while investigative resources were not unlimited. This dispersion gradually became a clear issue, as investigators had to split their attention across multiple possibilities, making it harder to dig deeply into any one direction. Pressure from the family and community, who continually hoped for positive news, made rejecting or shelving a lead a heavy decision, as each report carried the hope that Matthew was still somewhere within reach. In that context, the investigative team had to continually weigh pursuing new information against preserving the investigation's focus, avoiding letting the file be stretched too thin by unsubstantiated hypotheses. Gradually, lead evaluation criteria were tightened, emphasizing fit with existing facts, independent verifiability, and internal consistency of the information. Leads that failed these criteria, despite initial expectations, began to be systematically eliminated, not to narrow the truth, but to remove factors diluting the search process. Eliminating ineffective leads was done with utmost caution, as each such decision carried the risk of overlooking something important, yet it also reflected the necessity of maintaining a clear investigative structure in a chaotic information environment. Through this phase, the case file not only grew thicker in paperwork, but also more complex analytically, as each eliminated lead left questions about whether it had ever been part of the bigger picture. For the Evans family, the constant cycle of leads appearing and then vanishing created a painful emotional loop, where hope was ignited only to be quickly extinguished, leaving a sense of helplessness before a process they could not control. For the investigators, this phase of leads and noise became a true test of distinguishing signal from noise, forcing them to accept that not all information leads to the truth, and that maintaining direction in a complex missing person case is sometimes more important than pursuing every possibility indiscriminately. The continual elimination of ineffective leads and watching sighting-based investigative directions dead-end forced investigators to return to the core question about the nature of the disappearance, thereby shifting focus to analyzing the victim's own behavior as a foundation for reshaping the entire approach to the case. Matthew Evans' personal profile was systematically re-examined, not just basic information but behavioral factors, daily habits, family relationships, and his attachment to his surroundings, to assess whether any signs existed suggesting the possibility of intentionally leaving the area on his own. Through this analysis, Matthew's image emerged consistently as a child with no tendency to run away, no signs of psychological instability, no prolonged conflicts with family, and no clear motive to separate himself from his familiar environment. His routine activities before the disappearance showed no preparation or intent to leave, and the fact that he vanished in a short time without leaving signs of independent movement further weakened the runaway hypothesis. On that basis, the possibility of Matthew leaving the area voluntarily was gradually downgraded in internal assessments, not as an emotional decision, but as the result of comparing personal behavior to actual facts. Alongside this elimination process, attention turned back to the role of the stranger who had appeared early on, a detail once downplayed in the context of high social trust, but now placed under stricter analytical scrutiny. Investigators reviewed all information related to that appearance, from physical description, position, direction of movement, to witness reactions, to evaluate whether that presence fit a third-party intervention scenario. Though the stranger information was not specific enough to identify anyone, the fact that an unfamiliar individual appeared right at the critical time became a factor that could not be ignored in building a new hypothesis. Evaluating the stranger's role went beyond direct involvement to considering child approach scenarios in the social context of the era, where trust and habits of letting children move freely could create invisible security gaps. To strengthen or refute the abduction hypothesis, the team compared Matthew's case to similar child disappearances in the area, or in localities with comparable social characteristics, focusing on common factors like victim age, disappearance context, lack of clear physical signs, and the stranger's role in the final moments. Noted similarities were not meant to assert a rigid pattern, but to identify recurring characteristics that could help shape the perpetrator's modus operandi, if this was indeed an abduction. Through comparison, certain prominent features emerged, including rapid disappearance without drawing attention, no traces of disturbance, and the victim being separated from familiar surroundings in an extremely short time, factors often associated with calculated adult behavior, rather than a child's impulsive action. These analyses led to the abduction hypothesis being elevated to the center of internal discussions, not as a final conclusion, but as the explanation most consistent with the totality of collected facts. The adjustment in investigative strategy occurred alongside changes in approach as resources began to be reallocated to focus more on identifying individuals who could have accessed Matthew during the missing window, especially those not part of the known community or with reasons to be in the area at that time. Lead evaluation criteria were also adjusted to fit the abduction hypothesis, prioritizing information that could clarify third-party intervention over scattered sighting reports, not tied to a specific scenario. This shift was not just tactical but reflected a profound change in the investigative team's perception, as the case was no longer seen merely as a mysterious disappearance, but as the potential for intentional criminal act. Though no direct evidence yet confirmed the abduction hypothesis, placing it at the center of analysis helped restructure the file more consistently, allowing investigators to revisit the entire sequence from a new angle and reassess the value of facts once considered secondary. In that context, the abduction hypothesis became the pivot of the investigation, guiding how questions were asked, information filtered, and resources used, while marking a significant turning point in efforts to understand what really happened to Matthew Evans in that brief but decisive period. The hypothesis of abduction being placed at the center led to an inevitable step in the investigative process, systematically re-evaluating all individuals who could potentially be involved and compiling a list of suspects based on newly established criteria. This list not only included people who had appeared in previous tips, but also expanded to individuals who had a reasonable justification for being in the area at the time. Matthew Evans went missing, people who were not part of the familiar community but could still access the area without drawing attention. The compilation of the suspect list proceeded cautiously, with the goal of covering all possibilities without hastily labeling anyone as a criminal, as the investigative team was well aware that in a small town, any speculation could have long-lasting consequences for innocent people. Each suspect was categorized according to their degree of access to the victim, the plausibility of their presence in terms of time and location, as well as any personal history related to violent behavior, abuse, or similar precedents, though such information was often very limited, given the investigative conditions of that era. The interrogation process was carried out in parallel with alibi verification, focusing on precisely determining each suspect's activities during the critical time frame, where they were, who they interacted with, and even minor details that could confirm or rule out their involvement. The interrogations took place in a high-pressure environment, not only for the suspects but also for the investigators themselves, as every answer was cross-checked against existing evidence and the statements of others to identify consistency or discrepancies. During this process, many initially noteworthy suspects were gradually eliminated when their alibis were convincingly verified or when no sufficiently strong circumstantial evidence existed to keep them under suspicion. The elimination of suspects did not happen abruptly, but was the result of a prolonged series of cross-checks, reflecting the investigative team's caution in avoiding rushed conclusions based on intuition or external pressure. However, each eliminated suspect also meant the scope of possibilities narrowed, and the number of people remaining on the list gradually dwindled, highlighting the lack of specific leads that could point to a clear investigative direction. Meanwhile, time pressure continued to mount, as each passing day reduced the likelihood of gathering accurate information and caused witnesses' memories to fade further, creating a disadvantageous cycle for the investigation. Public sentiment in the community, which had initially focused on unity and support, began shifting to anxiety and suspicion, as the prolonged case led residents to question their own safety and that of their families. Rumors spread, sometimes targeting specific individuals in the town, forcing the investigative team to handle the case while also managing social impacts to prevent panic or harm to unrelated people. The Evans family, meanwhile, faced growing exhaustion and disappointment as names were added to the suspect list only to be removed, leaving an unresolved void regarding Matthew's disappearance. The expectation that identifying a primary suspect would open the path to the truth was gradually replaced by the feeling that all efforts were spinning in circles within a closed space, with no new evidence to break the deadlock. For the investigative team, this phase became a major strategic challenge, as they had to decide whether to continue digging deeper into the remaining suspects, despite the lack of evidence, or to temporarily accept that the case was approaching the limits of what could be achieved with available resources and tools. Internal meetings became more frequent, focusing on reviewing the entire process from the beginning and assessing whether any details had been overlooked or undervalued in the early days of the investigation. However, despite efforts to revisit and restructure, the absence of clear physical evidence and reliable witnesses meant every avenue remained at the level of hypothesis. The deadlock did not arrive through a formal decision, but through a noticeable slowdown in investigative activities, as new steps became rare, and repeated actions no longer yielded additional information. In that context, the disappearance of Matthew Evans began to take on the characteristics of an unsolvable case, where every path had been explored to some degree, but none led to a definitive answer. Pressure from public opinion and professional expectations forced the investigators to confront the harsh reality that not every case could be resolved in a short time frame, especially when key elements had been obscured by time and circumstances. This phase of suspects in deadlock, therefore, not only reflected the limitations of investigative tools, but also marked a breaking point in the case's momentum, where the initial urgency gradually shifted to a state of tense waiting, laying the groundwork for an uncertain future, whose length and consequences no one could predict at the time. The prolonged deadlock in identifying a specific suspect and the absence of new verifiable leads gradually brought the investigation to a point where active efforts no longer produced substantial progress, forcing local law enforcement leadership to confront a difficult but pragmatic decision. The Matthew Evans missing person case file was brought up for review at the command level, where the entire investigative process from the initial hours to the suspect pursuit phase was thoroughly re-examined to objectively assess what had been accomplished and what could not be overcome with available resources. The decision to transition the case to cold case status was not made as an abandonment, but as an acknowledgement that the traditional investigative methods of that era had reached their limits, and continuing to maintain high-intensity efforts without new evidence would only further deplete manpower and create unrealistic expectations for the family. Along with this decision, active investigative activities were halted in a controlled manner, meaning no more large-scale searches, no more continuous rounds of interrogations, and no more pursuing every vague tip as before. Instead, a state of waiting for potential breakthrough information. The case file was reorganized, categorized, and archived according to standards, with the aim of preserving as much of the collected material as possible for potential reactivation in the future if conditions allowed. Every document, from witness statements, crime scene diagrams, and interrogation records to internal investigative notes, was sealed as part of an incomplete picture, reflecting the prolonged but unfulfilled effort to uncover the truth. Archiving was not merely administrative, but the only way to ensure that Matthew Evans's case was not completely forgotten amid the constant influx of new cases. In parallel with internal procedures, the Evans family was informed of the change in the case's status, a heavy conversation as they had to accept the reality that the investigation would no longer proceed with the same intensity. This notification came without specific promises beyond the commitment that the file would be retained and reviewed if new information emerged, leaving the family with an indescribable void, where hope was not entirely extinguished, but no longer sustained by concrete actions. For them, the transition to cold case status signified an indefinite pause, where unanswered questions had to coexist with everyday life. Meanwhile, for the local community, the winding down of the investigation gradually altered the atmosphere that had once enveloped the town, as community searches, lively discussions, and the frequent presence of authorities became memories, giving way to the return of familiar routines. Time began creating an increasingly clear distance between the present and the moment Matthew disappeared, gradually blurring details that had once been constantly mentioned, shifting the case from urgent to a story recounted only on rare occasions. The passage of time did not occur at a specific milestone, but through the accumulation of years, during which the Matthew Evans file lay dormant in storage, awaiting a new factor that no one could envision at the time. Transitioning to cold case status marked a significant turning point, not in resolving the case but in how it was perceived and handled, as it shifted from an active investigation to a dormant file, existing as a reminder of the limits of justice in the context of insufficient information and technology. For the Evans family, this decision closed a phase full of hope and tension, opening a long period of waiting and endurance, where Matthew's absence was no longer confronted through specific search activities, but through learning to live with uncertainty. For the investigative team, the Matthew Evans cold case became part of the repository of unsolved cases, preserved not for immediate expectations, but for the belief that one day, under different circumstances, the missing pieces might appear and completely alter the understanding of the disappearance that had once shaken an entire small community in South Carolina. While the Matthew Evans missing person case file was put away and left dormant in storage, in a completely different space, the life of the boy from back then continued along a trajectory detached from his old identity, beginning with a new name and a new story, unrelated to South Carolina. The identity change was not presented as a choice, but as an established reality, where documents, introductions, and the way people addressed him no longer connected to the past, creating a legal and social shell that allowed him to exist in the new environment. The new living space was far different from the familiar community of before, with strangers, different habits, and a daily structure that forced him to relearn everything from scratch, where quick adaptation became a prerequisite to avoid raising questions. All traces related to his origins were blurred or eliminated, from small details in stories to gaps in personal records, causing the past to gradually become an unmentioned foggy area. In that context, childhood memories did not vanish entirely, but existed as fragmented pieces, lacking sequence and clear anchors to connect them, as familiar images, sounds, or sensations from early childhood appeared and faded without explanation. This disconnection did not happen suddenly, but formed gradually over time, as old memories were not reinforced by the surrounding environment and were replaced by new experiences, blurring the boundary between what had happened and what was happening. In daily life, he learned to observe and respond according to the patterns of the new environment, adjusting behavior, language, and self-expression to fit in, not through rebellion but through calculated silence. Adapting to survive was not just meeting daily requirements, but also learning not to ask questions or seek answers for the gaps in his own life story, as any effort against the current flow risked disrupting the fragile order that had been established. Over time, this silence gradually became a self-protection mechanism, helping him maintain stability in the new environment, but also reinforcing the distance from the past, making old memories even harder to access. Alongside adaptation, controlling personal information became an inseparable part of life, even if not explicitly named. Questions about origins, family or childhood, were answered with brief, consistent information that revealed no vulnerabilities, creating a story plausible enough to avoid further probing. The surrounding environment accepted this information as obvious truth, as there was no specific reason to doubt it, especially when he demonstrated stable integration and adherence to social norms. Information control came not only from outside, but gradually became internalized, as he himself learned to avoid thoughts or memories that could shake the consistency of the new identity. The new life, therefore, was not a perfect replacement for what was lost, but a structure built to maintain existence, where each passing day further reinforced the distance between the current person and the child who had once disappeared from South Carolina. Even without full awareness of what had happened, a sense of lack persisted as a silent undercurrent, manifesting in indescribable moments when he felt familiar with things he had never experienced in his current life. These sensations did not lead to specific actions, but were only vaguely noted before being quickly pushed aside to make room for the practical demands of daily life. Throughout this process, the new identity was not just a name or a set of documents, but became the sole frame of reference for positioning himself in the surrounding world, while the old identity was gradually pushed back into an undefined region, existing more as a possibility than a reality. The new life was maintained through outward stability, but beneath it was a fragile structure dependent on unanswered questions remaining unasked and scattered memory fragments, staying unconnected, insufficient to form a complete story about the person who had once been Matthew Evans. The new identity gradually became the sole frame of reference for daily life, but the maturation process within that framework showed many abnormal signs compared to children raised in stable environments with clear histories. The lack of information about one's origins manifested not only in gaps in documents or family stories, but also permeated the way he understood himself, as basic questions about roots, blood relations, and personal past lacked concrete answers to hold on to. This ambiguity did not erupt into an immediate crisis, but existed as an unstable foundation, causing each developmental step to occur in a state of self-adjustment to fit the pre-constructed narrative. In the new environment, he learned to observe other children to mimic their behaviors, from how they talked about family, mentioned childhood, to how they responded to seemingly harmless questions, because any deviation could draw unwanted attention. In that context, a mechanism of silence gradually formed, not as an explicit imposition, but as a learned reflex, where speaking little, asking little, and avoiding depth became the safest way to maintain stability. This mechanism applied not only to those around him, but also extended to his inner world, as he learned to push disturbing thoughts out of consciousness, replacing them with specific immediate concerns. The early psychological impact of this process appeared in a hard-to-name sense of alienation, a subtle difference from peers, despite no obvious external signs, as he frequently sensed an invisible distance between himself and others that he could not explain in words. The absence of a consistent past narrative made building personal identity patchwork-like, relying more on environmental feedback than on memories or family traditions, requiring extra effort in each developmental stage to achieve balance. Instead of rebelling or asking direct questions, he chose passive adaptation, focusing on meeting external expectations like academics, discipline, and social integration, as these areas provided clear criteria, less dependent on personal history. Over time, this strategy provided a certain sense of control, helping him navigate childhood transitions without major conflicts, but it also reinforced the habit of avoiding self-related topics. The long-term coping method built on that foundation prioritized stability, risk minimization, and maintaining a consistent image to others, even if it meant accepting unfillable gaps in self-understanding. The signs of a stolen childhood lay not in overt events, but in the lack of foundational experiences most children take for granted, such as seamless family memories, origin stories, or a sense of belonging to a personal historical flow. Instead, he grew up in a continuous present, where the past was severed and the future built on unverified assumptions, creating a psychological structure geared toward coping rather than exploration. Over the years, small choices made to protect stability accumulated into a way of life, where silence and compliance became primary means to avoid inner conflict, though the cost was prolonged delay in the process of understanding and accepting oneself. A stolen childhood, therefore, was not just the loss of early years in a different environment, but also the loss of the opportunity to form identity based on truth, forcing him to mature faster in some aspects and slower in others, in a fragile balance maintained through constant adaptation and deliberate silence. The coping through silence and adaptation once helped maintain stability in the early adult years, but over time, small details related to identity began revealing mismatches that could not be fully concealed. Personal documents tied to the new name were not always complete or seamless. Some administrative information existed in fragmented form, patched together as needed, rather than reflecting a full personal history. In situations requiring deeper verification, those gaps did not immediately arouse external suspicion, but were enough to create a quiet unease for the person bearing the identity, upon realizing there were questions that could not be answered with specific truth. Personal background information, though presented consistently on the surface, still harbored subtle contradictions, from details about birthplace, early life timelines, to family stories recounted in formulaic ways, but lacking experiential depth. These contradictions did not manifest as open conflicts, but appeared as discrepancies between what was said and what was felt, making each mention of the past a test of maintaining the memorized narrative. Questions from others, whether casual or social, were often evaded with brief answers or topic shifts, a reflex honed early to avoid uncontrollable voids. This evasion served not only to protect immediate identity consistency, but also to delay confronting growing inner doubts. Internally, inner conflict became more pronounced as the sense of lacking self-information could no longer be fully suppressed, especially in moments requiring self-positioning in long-term relationships or foundational decisions. The gap between a stable present life and the feeling of an unknown past portion created simmering psychological pressure, not strong enough to shatter the existing order, but enough to shake the sense of self-wholeness. Faced with that pressure, the familiar strategy continued, delaying truth-seeking by focusing on immediate life demands, prioritizing work, responsibilities, and current relationships over questions without clear answers. This delay was not mere avoidance, but reflected survival calculus, where delving into the past felt like a potential threat to hard-won stability. Each mismatched sign was thus noted and temporarily set aside, becoming fragmented pieces at the edge of consciousness, awaiting an undetermined time to connect. Over time, their accumulation altered self-perception, as identity no longer felt like a solid foundation, but a structure requiring constant maintenance through control and avoidance. Moments of self-questioning grew more frequent, though not leading to action, as each thought of seeking truth triggered questions about possible consequences, from disrupting current relationships to risking familiar security. In that state, delay became the lowest risk choice, allowing life to continue without direct confrontation with the unknown. However, prolonged delay also made mismatches harder to ignore, as they shifted from isolated details to a pattern indicating something fundamental unexplained. Inner conflict, thus, revolved not only around past questions, but also whether one could fully live in an identity built on voids. Though no concrete action to seek truth yet, this phase marked a key perceptual shift. The idea of a parallel story existing alongside the current life was no longer dismissed as fanciful, but became a possibility to weigh. The mismatching signs, therefore, did not lead to explosion or immediate change, but quietly accumulated as an inner pull, preparing for a time when continued avoidance would no longer be sustainable. The mismatching signs were pushed below conscious surface by the busyness of adult life, where new roles and responsibilities gradually filled mental space and created a sense of forward progress. Adult life was built on the stability provided by the current identity, with work, social relationships, and daily rhythms following familiar norms, enough to foster control and autonomy. In that context, forming one's own family became a major milestone, not just emotionally, but because it further reinforced the present structure, bringing belonging and clear purpose. The new family was built on practical values oriented toward the future, where roles as partner and father were embraced seriously, demanding stable, reliable presence. These responsibilities created a strong psychological barrier against unresolved questions, as any disruption to the current foundation felt like a threat not only to oneself, but to dependents. Fear of upsetting the present thus became a dominant factor, causing continued delay in exploring the past despite recurring abnormal signs. Distance from the past was maintained not through total denial, but by placing it outside priorities, viewing it as a faint, unnecessary part for current life functioning. Questions about origins, early years, and reasons for personal narrative gaps were pushed beneath layers of daily concerns, where they could exist without immediate resolution. Truth, in this context, was not rejected but buried under layers of responsibilities, obligations, and practical worries, becoming a latent factor left untouched. Maintaining that distance also reflected an early honed psychological strategy, prioritizing stability over cognitive completeness, valuing continued living over full past understanding. In family life, self-narratives were recounted minimally and consistently, enough for basic communication but without opening space for deeper questions, creating a safe zone where current identity went unchallenged. Private moments, free from social roles, sometimes carried a hard-to-name sense of lack, but it was quickly overshadowed by specific family, work and nurturing demands. Adulthood thus resembled not a journey of self-discovery, but a process of building and protecting a present structure, where any destabilizing elements were controlled or sidelined. The longer the past distance grew, the more abstract truth became, not a specific story needing clarification, but a vague possibility existing without confirmation. In that state, burial occurred not through active effort, but through accumulated small, repeated choices, each time prioritizing present over past, choosing silence over questions, deciding that knowing more might bring more risk than benefit. Over time, these choices formed a life trajectory, where maintaining family and self-stability was the ultimate goal, with personal narrative gaps accepted as the price. Truth was buried not from lack of curiosity or courage, but because it was pitted against what held most value in the present, making rekindling the past hard to justify in adult life's logic. In that context, the victim of a long-ago disappearance continued living as a normal adult, bearing a complete identity on paper and in society's eyes, while part of personal history remained out of reach, kept still not because it did not exist, but because it had not yet been allowed to emerge in a life structure built too long to easily change. The truth, once buried beneath the layer of stability in adult life, began to shake not because of a decision to pursue the past, but because of a procedural event arising from administrative and scientific requirements, completely detached from the old disappearance story. In the process of handling a personal medical or legal issue, collecting a biological sample became a necessary step, accompanied by no suspicion or special intent beyond completing the file according to standard procedure. The DNA sample was taken and processed like millions of others, evoking no specific memories of South Carolina or a child who had once vanished, because at that time, the current identity remained the sole frame of reference for all activities related to oneself. This biological data, after analysis, was entered into a modern storage system serving multiple purposes, from medical and administrative to genealogical matching, where it existed as a sequence of codes carrying no personal story. In that system, the new data did not stand alone, but was placed alongside millions of other previously collected samples, creating the possibility of automatic comparison, independent of the will or awareness of the person involved. It was this comparison process that led to the detection of a preliminary match, initially flagged only as an anomaly, requiring further verification, because the degree of similarity exceeded the usual random threshold. The match did not immediately lead to a conclusion, but it was enough for the system to issue an internal alert, requiring deeper review to determine whether a biological connection existed between records that seemed unrelated. Through additional verification steps, that connection gradually became clearer, suggesting the possibility that a current identity was directly related to a missing child record stored decades earlier. This discovery was not treated as a final conclusion, but as a modern scientific clue powerful enough to disrupt the dormant state of a case once considered unlikely to progress further. Information about the match was forwarded to the relevant authorities through internal channels, triggering a series of verification procedures to ensure the result was not a technical error or random coincidence. This notification was handled cautiously, because the consequences of an incorrect conclusion could have profound impacts on multiple individuals and families, especially in cases that had remained unsolved for decades. For those receiving the information on the authorities' side, the breakthrough clue did not lie in immediately confirming anything, but in opening a possibility, previously considered almost impossible, that a missing victim from 1960 might still be alive and existing under a different identity. That possibility was not treated as obvious truth, but as a hypothesis requiring rigorous verification, yet the mere fact that it had a scientific basis was enough to change the entire perspective on the case. In that context, the old file was no longer a closed set of documents, but became a reference point for a new series of comparisons, where modern data was placed alongside information collected decades earlier to identify compatibilities. For the individual living with the current identity, these movements occurred entirely outside their awareness, as daily life continued with work, family, and unchanging responsibilities, while on another level, their own biological data was becoming a potential key to a long-interrupted story. The parallel existence of these two realities reflected a key characteristic of the modern era, where scientific advances can connect historical fragments without the active involvement of those concerned. The modern clue, therefore, did not emerge as a coincidental discovery in traditional investigation, but as the result of a data-driven system, where truth can surface from cold, objective comparisons. The possibility that the victim was still alive, once seen as slim and gradually fading over time, was now seriously reconsidered, not as emotional hope, but as a hypothesis with basis needing clarification. This phase marked a significant shift in the story's trajectory, as past and present began to show signs of intersecting through technology, and what had been buried beneath the stability of adult life faced the risk of being pulled back into the light by a chain of data, carrying no memory, yet capable of retelling a story that people had been unable to complete for decades. The possibility that the victim was still alive, only recently repositioned as a hypothesis with basis, quickly led to a series of scientific and procedural actions, in which genealogical DNA analysis became the center of all subsequent evaluations. The biological data, that had signaled a preliminary match, was subjected to in-depth analysis, not limited to direct comparison, but extended to identifying indirect blood relations through family branches, with the goal of building a sufficiently detailed genetic map to eliminate errors. This method allowed experts to trace back distant relatives, comparing genetic similarities with existing records in the system, thereby assessing the degree of fit between the current data and families that had reported missing children in the same time period. In this process, the missing child file of Matthew Evans was pulled from passive storage and placed alongside the new analysis results, creating a rare intersection between modern data and information collected decades earlier. The comparison was not simple but required careful examination of every detail, from age at the time of disappearance, geographic area, to biological characteristics inferable from genealogical data, to ensure that all similarities were explained by scientific logic, rather than a desire for answers. Through multiple rounds of analysis, a potential identity gradually emerged, not as a certain conclusion, but as a high-probability possibility, sufficient to justify continued investment of resources and attention from authorities. This identity was constructed from the intersection of multiple factors, including the degree of genetic match, temporal and geographic fit, and notable gaps in the current personal record that aligned remarkably with the old missing person file. The formation of a potential identity did not mean affirming the truth, but it created a new anchor for the investigation, where hypotheses were no longer floating, but attached to a specific individual in the present. In light of these findings, the Matthew Evans disappearance case was internally reactivated, marking a shift from dormant status to reconsideration from an entirely different angle. The reactivation was not public, but occurred as a necessary preparatory step, allowing relevant units to access documents again, update data, and reevaluate what had been collected in the light of modern technology. At the same time, security and information control procedures were tightened, as any error in this sensitive phase could cause harm not only to the investigation, but also to the individuals involved, especially since the potential identity had not yet been officially confirmed. Preparing for a modern investigation involved not just mobilizing technology, but also adjusting mindset, as investigators had to combine scientific data with social context and traditional methods to avoid biased conclusions. Old questions were revisited, not to repeat failed past steps, but to see if they held new meaning when placed alongside newly emerged information. Hypotheses once set aside were re-examined for relevance, while details previously considered minor could now become key pieces in confirming or disproving the potential identity. The entire process unfolded in a delicate balance between expectation and caution, with each new discovery verified through multiple layers to avoid self-reinforcing a hypothesis simply because it was appealing or groundbreaking. For those involved in the analysis, the DNA turning point lay not in the spectacle of technology, but in its ability to connect facts separated by time, giving a frozen case a chance to be re-examined in the language of data and probability. In that context, preparing for a modern investigation aimed not only to confirm an identity, but also to ensure that if the truth was revealed, it would withstand all legal and scientific scrutiny. Every decision made in this phase carried the awareness that mistakes could not only delay progress, but also harm people who had lived with uncertainty for decades. The DNA turning point, therefore, was not perceived as an approaching end, but as the start of a new phase, where the past was approached with modern tools, and where the chance of finding a final answer depended on precisely combining data, procedure, and the patience needed to reach the heart of the truth. The preparation for a modern investigation quickly led to an organizational shift, as the Matthew Evans disappearance file was officially transferred to the Cold Case Unit, a team established to handle cases spanning decades by combining traditional investigative methods with new technology. Receiving the file was not merely an administrative procedure, but a process of re-evaluating the entire case from scratch, with Cold Case Unit investigators approaching it from a fresh perspective, unbound by assumptions formed during the initial investigation years ago. The old file was removed from physical storage and began a comprehensive digitization process, transforming hundreds of pages of paper documents, handwritten notes, crime scene diagrams, and interrogation transcripts into searchable, comparable, and systematically analyzable data. Digitization aimed not only to preserve documents, but also to reveal details once buried in the fragmentation of paper records, as information points could be rearranged in various ways to uncover patterns or connections previously hard to detect. Alongside digitization, newly collected data from DNA analysis and other modern sources was placed next to the old file for systematic comparison, focusing on checking compatibility between what was recorded in the past and what was emerging in the present. Details about timing, location, personal descriptions, and gaps in the current personal record were compared with the 1960 disappearance data to determine if the match exceeded random chance. Through this process, points once considered vague or unimportant in the old file began to take on new meaning, as they aligned remarkably with modern findings, further reinforcing the plausibility of the identified potential identity. Comparing old and new data also allowed the Cold Case Unit to reassess previously proposed hypotheses, considering whether they needed adjustment or complete dismissal in light of new information. At the same time, re-interviewing surviving witnesses was implemented cautiously, not to relive past emotions, but to verify specific details from a current perspective, as memories may have changed but core information could still be confirmed. These interviews focused on clarifying timelines, locations, and appearances of individuals mentioned, especially details potentially directly related to the abduction hypothesis and the new identity being traced. Differences between old and new statements were not seen as contradictions to resolve by choosing right or wrong, but as additional data helping to better understand how memory and perception had been affected by time. In the file reopening process, tracing the new identity became a central task, conducted by comparing administrative information, residence history, and legal traces attached to the current identity, to build a continuous picture of the life of the individual suspected to be Matthew Evans from the disappearance to the present. This work required coordination among multiple agencies and departments, as each piece of information needed independent verification to avoid errors that could derail the entire investigation. Tracing was not intended to invade personal life, but to ensure every step was based on verified facts strong enough to meet strict legal standards. Throughout the file reopening phase, the cold case unit operated in a balance between urgency and caution, fully aware that each decision could have profound consequences for people who had lived with this case for decades. The biggest difference from the original investigation lay in data no longer being limited to what could be directly observed at the scene, but expanded by the ability to connect information on a large scale, allowing investigators to see links transcending time and geography. Reopening the file, therefore, was not just continuing an old investigation, but restructuring the entire understanding of the case, placing past and present in the same analytical framework, to prepare for next steps based on combining traditional investigative experience with the power of modern technology. The newly established steps for tracing identity, derived from the process of reopening the case file, led to the decision to make direct contact with the individual suspected to be Matthew Evans, a carefully considered move aimed at ensuring compliance with legal procedures while minimizing psychological impact on the person involved. The contact did not take place as a confrontation or interrogation, but was designed as a verification meeting in which investigators approached with the intent of clarifying information rather than imposing conclusions, allowing the individual to engage with the matter under controlled and transparent conditions. During this process, the initial reaction was recorded as important data, not for speculation, but to assess the degree of alignment between current behavior and what would be expected from someone with a history of disrupted identity. Concurrently with the contact, an independent DNA confirmation test was conducted, involving the collection of additional biological samples to rule out any possibility of technical error or misinterpretation from the initial results. The new DNA samples were analyzed at different laboratories to ensure objectivity, then directly compared with previously collected genealogical data, as well as any biological samples still retained from the old case file. This process focused not only on the degree of genetic match, but also on related statistical indicators to determine the probability of blood relationship exceeding the certainty threshold according to current scientific standards. At the same time, other forensic data were cross-referenced, including information on biological age, morphological features inferable from medical records, and anthropometric factors consistent with the description of Matthew Evans at the time of disappearance, in order to create a multidimensional confirmation picture not reliant on a single source. The forensic cross-referencing was conducted with a high degree of caution, as any inconsistency could delay or alter the direction of verification, while consistent matches across multiple sources would strengthen the reliability of the final conclusion. When the independent analysis results converged on the same conclusion, confirming a direct biological link to the Evans family, the potential identity transitioned to a state of scientific confirmation, moving beyond the hypothetical stage to become a solidly grounded fact. The official conclusion was not reached hastily, but underwent an internal review process in which investigators, forensic experts, and legal advisors collectively evaluated all data to ensure no vulnerabilities remained that could be questioned later. The confirmation of Matthew Evans's identity, a child once considered permanently missing, carried special legal significance, requiring absolute accuracy to avoid irreversible consequences for the individual and related parties. Once the conclusion was agreed upon, the case file was updated to reflect the new status, formally recording the victim's identity, along with the scientific and forensic documents supporting the confirmation process. Updating the file was not merely procedural, but marked a fundamental shift in how the case was viewed, as a question persisting for decades finally received resolution at its most basic level. For the investigators, the identity confirmation phase was not the end of responsibility, but a critical milestone demanding accuracy, restraint, and respect for the human being behind the data and records. The entire process was conducted under strict confidentiality to ensure sensitive information did not leak before necessary legal steps were completed, while facilitating an orderly handling of subsequent consequences. Identity confirmation, therefore, was not merely the matching of DNA strands or data tables, but the convergence of science, law, and ethical responsibility, restoring a stolen identity to its rightful place in the case history, and laying the foundation for subsequent decisions based on an indisputably established truth. The official confirmation of Matthew Evans's identity forced the case file's focus to shift once again, from the question of who the victim was to what really happened on the day he disappeared, and who was responsible for that decades-long rupture. Based on the new forensic conclusions, the entire initial sequence of events was reconstructed from scratch, not to repeat old steps, but to restructure the chain of events in light of the strengthened kidnapping hypothesis. Timelines, locations, and behaviors were resequenced logically, combining past testimonies, preserved crime scene data, and modern understanding of criminal patterns related to child abductions. The reconstruction focused on the critical gap where Matthew vanished, analyzing how an individual could approach control and remove him from the area without drawing attention in the societal context of that era. Concurrently with this reconstruction, the old suspect list was systematically reviewed, not to identify a new name from nothing, but to reassess previously considered individuals under modern criteria. Suspects once excluded due to lack of direct evidence were re-examined in the new context, where the absence of evidence from years ago no longer carried absolute exclusionary weight, but needed evaluation alongside the newly confirmed data on the victim's identity and life journey. This review also included re-evaluating previously accepted alibis, cross-checking them against current verifiability and the reliability of confirmation sources, as many witnesses or indirect evidence no longer existed. During the re-investigation, the question of prosecutability became an unavoidable focus, requiring close involvement from legal advisors to assess whether existing evidence met prosecution standards. Although the victim's identity had been clarified, pursuing criminal accountability still depended on identifying specific criminal acts and direct links between suspects and Matthew's disappearance, a requirement increasingly difficult to meet as time had faded or erased many key traces. Legal limitations became clear in this evaluation, including the fact that many potential suspects had died, physical evidence was no longer viable for testing, and barriers related to statutes of limitations or proof standards under current law. These limitations did not diminish the value of reinvestigation, but set realistic boundaries on what could be achieved prosecutorially, forcing investigators to clearly distinguish between illuminating historical truth and the ability to bring the case to court. The criminal investigation conclusion was formed on that basis, reflecting a balance among facts, legal feasibility, and responsibility to the victim, not as a definitive statement on the perpetrator, but as a comprehensive assessment of what could be confirmed and what remained beyond justice's reach. The reinvestigation, though unable to reverse the losses that occurred, played a vital role in completing the case picture, officially recognizing that Matthew Evans's disappearance was not a random or spontaneous event, but the result of deliberate intervention. Thereby, the case file was updated not only with the victim's identity, but also with investigative conclusions reflecting the fullest possible understanding of the incident's nature, closing a long phase of scattered hypotheses and laying the foundation for how the case would be remembered in local judicial history. Once the criminal investigation conclusion was completed to the extent possible, and Matthew Evans's identity had been confirmed by rigorous scientific and legal standards, the case's focus shifted to arranging a profoundly meaningful meeting, where people separated by time and circumstances faced each other for the first time as blood family. Organizing the meeting was prepared meticulously, with close coordination among authorities, psychological experts, and involved parties to minimize potential emotional shocks, while ensuring all decisions were made on a fully voluntary and informed basis. The location, timing, and format were carefully considered to create a neutral, sufficiently private space where the parties could approach each other without direct external pressure, especially given the considerable attention the case had attracted. The meeting between Matthew and his biological family unfolded as a moment both confirmatory and challenging, as faces familiar only through faded memories or archival photos now appeared in reality, forcing both sides to adjust their expectations to an irreversible truth. Emotional reactions did not follow a uniform pattern, as each person carried their own history of loss, waiting, and adaptation, resulting in varied expressions from intense emotion to reserved caution. For the biological family, reuniting with Matthew was not just the return of a loved one, but a confrontation with the decades-long void, where imaginings of the child from years ago had to be adjusted to accept the adult before them. For Matthew, the meeting required reconciling his current identity with the newly confirmed blood ties, a process that could not happen instantly, but needed time for emotions and cognition to find balance. In that space, gestures, glances, and silences often carried more meaning than words, reflecting the parties' efforts to find appropriate ways to connect without hurting each other. Concurrently with managing the meeting at the personal level, media management was implemented tightly to control information flow and prevent a private moment from becoming overly exploited. Statements were drafted in neutral language, focusing on confirming basic clarified facts while minimizing speculation about emotions or motives of involved parties. This aimed to protect Matthew's and the family's privacy, as well as ensure the verification and reunion process was not influenced by public pressure or unrealistic external expectations. Throughout, authorities maintained a coordinating and supportive role, ready to intervene if needed to ensure all interactions occurred safely and respectfully. When the final verification steps related to identity and family ties were completed, the reunion was recorded as an official milestone in the case file, marking the closure of the confirmation phase and the opening of a new reality for those involved. Ending verification did not mean all questions were answered or all wounds healed, but it established a foundation for an undisputed legal and scientific truth. For Matthew and his biological family, the meeting was not the end of the story, but the beginning of rebuilding a relationship in a context entirely different from what had been lost. For the case file, the reunion served as a key milestone, where identity was restored to its proper place and the victim's existence was fully confirmed, allowing involved parties to shift from searching and verifying to confronting the consequences of the truth. In the intersection of personal emotion and public duty, Matthew Evans's reunion became a symbolic event, not for its perfection, but because it reflected humanity's capacity to find each other after ruptures seemingly permanent, even at the cost of time, memories, and things irretrievable. The reunion marked the end of the official verification phase, but simultaneously opened a much more complex one, where family relationships had to be readjusted in a context that was no longer what had existed before Matthew disappeared. Re-establishing relationships did not follow a simple model of return, as between the parties lay the distance of decades lived apart, experiences that could not be shared, and roles that had long been shaped. The biological family had to learn to approach Matthew no longer as a missing child, but as an adult with his own life, responsibilities, and ties, while Matthew had to confront expanding his concept of family to include people who were both familiar and strange. This adjustment took place step by step, through controlled contacts, short conversations, and necessary silences to avoid imposing expectations or overwhelming emotions that could harm the parties involved. In that context, psychological therapy became an important support tool, not aimed at immediate healing, but at creating a safe space for processing the complex emotions arising from the belated reunion. Therapy sessions focused on identifying and accepting contradictory emotional reactions, from joy and relief to feelings of loss, anger, or confusion, treating them as reasonable responses to an event beyond ordinary experience. For Matthew, therapy helped clarify long-accumulated identity conflicts, when his current identity and biologically confirmed identity did not fully align, creating a sense of being pulled in two different directions. Integrating these two parts of identity did not happen by eliminating one side, but by acknowledging that both were legitimate parts of the current person, even though they were formed in very different circumstances. Identity conflict also appeared in how Matthew positioned himself in family relationships, as the roles of son and sibling had to be redefined in a context where too much time had passed to return to the starting point. The long-term adaptation process therefore required patience and flexibility from all parties, with acceptance that the new relationship did not need to resemble what had been lost to have value. Instead of trying to recreate a past that no longer existed, the parties gradually moved toward building a form of connection suited to the present, where presence, respect, and voluntary choice mattered more than filling every historical gap. In daily life, Matthew continued to maintain his previous roles, from work to his own family, while gradually opening space for connection with his biological family, a process that ran parallel rather than replacing. This parallelism reflected an important reality of post-reunion, that rediscovering origins did not mean losing the current life, but it could not happen without significant psychological and emotional adjustments. The lasting impact of the case was evident in how each involved individual re-examined their own history, as years of waiting, doubt, and adaptation were placed in a new context, forcing them to reinterpret the meaning of decisions made in the past. For the biological family, knowing Matthew was alive brought comfort, but also came with pain over the irretrievable years, creating a difficult-to-reconcile dual emotional state. For Matthew, the confirmed truth provided answers to the mismatched signs that had haunted him, but it also posed new challenges in living with a history he had not directly chosen. In the long term, post-reunion was not measured by the degree of immediate bonding, but by the parties' ability to continue maintaining mutual respect, allowing the relationship to develop at a natural pace rather than under societal expectations. The lasting effects of the case also extended beyond the family, impacting how the community and authorities viewed long-term missing persons cases, emphasizing that finding the victim was only part of the journey, while supporting their reintegration with the new truth was a long-term challenge. In that context, Matthew Evans' post-reunion became a transitional phase, where the truth had been confirmed, but its meaning was still being gradually understood and integrated into life by those involved, reflecting that cases resolved on paper still left psychological and social echoes far beyond the official conclusion announcement. The emotional and family relationship adjustments after the reunion could not be separated from the lingering question of who caused the initial rupture, shifting the focus of the case once again toward the perpetrator and the possibility of bringing them to justice. Based on updated investigation conclusions, hypotheses about the offender were systematically compiled, no longer relying on scattered speculation but on reconstructing events, behavioral patterns, and access to the victim in the social context at the time of Matthew Evans' disappearance. These hypotheses included individuals from the initial suspect list, as well as scenarios involving intervention by strangers outside the local community, reflecting the understanding that abduction was likely carried out by someone outside the circle of acquaintances. The compilation did not aim to pinpoint a single name but to identify common characteristics of potential perpetrators, from mobility and familiarity with the area to possible motives in the social context of that era. Alongside building hypotheses, remaining evidence was realistically reassessed, acknowledging that most physical evidence had been degraded by time or no longer existed in a state verifiable by modern standards. Stored documents, statements, and investigation notes were placed in the context of the collection period's limitations, making their use to prove specific criminal acts far more difficult than using them to understand general events. The absence of key witnesses, many of whom had passed away or could no longer provide reliable testimony, further highlighted the biggest barrier to prosecution, as the chain of proof could not be completed solely by logical inference. Assessing prosecutability therefore had to adhere to strict legal standards, where reasonable doubt was not enough to substitute for direct or indirect evidence of probative value in court. In this process, legal advisors played a key role in determining the boundary between investigative truth and legal feasibility, clarifying that knowing what likely happened did not equate to proving it under judicial standards. Insufficient grounds for prosecution became a pragmatic conclusion, not due to lack of effort, but because of insurmountable limitations of time, data, and procedure. This conclusion did not deny that a crime had occurred but only reflected that current legal tools were inadequate to impose criminal responsibility on a specific individual without violating fundamental principles of justice. In that context, the concept of incomplete justice became clear, as the case was illuminated at the level of historical truth, but could not be completed at the level of prosecution and punishment. For the Evans family and Matthew, the inability to identify and convict the perpetrator brought another form of loss, where answers to who and why remained endless questions, even though most of the picture had been pieced together. For the justice system, this outcome reflected an unavoidable reality of long-term cases, where time was both an enemy of truth and a barrier to enforcing justice. Recognizing incomplete justice was not meant to justify shortcomings, but to honestly acknowledge that some cases could only be resolved to a certain degree, beyond which lay limits no system could fully overcome. In that context, Matthew Evans' file closed its criminal investigation portion with a cautious conclusion, where truth was confirmed, moral responsibility noted, but legal responsibility could not be imposed, leaving a hard-to-fill gap between knowing what happened and seeing justice fully executed. The acknowledgement that justice could not be fully enforced through criminal prosecution led to the final evaluation of the case's legal status, where authorities had to determine how to officially record the missing person file of Matthew Evans after core questions had been clarified. Legally, the case was no longer considered an unidentified missing person, as the victim's identity had been confirmed, survival proven, and the nature of the disappearance concluded as the result of intentional intervention. This status created an important distinction between a case being marked solved and closed, two concepts often misunderstood as synonymous but carrying very different meanings in the justice system. Solved reflected that central investigative questions had reliable answers based on scientific evidence and verification data, while closed typically implied that all legal aspects, including prosecution and trial, had been completed or were no longer pursuable. In Matthew Evans' case, it was determined solved because the truth about the victim and key events had been clarified, but not closed in the traditional sense of finalizing with a conviction, due to insurmountable legal limitations. Clearly distinguishing these statuses had significance not only terminologically, but in how the justice system recorded responsibility and investigative achievements, avoiding equating confirmed truth with executed justice. For cold case units, shifting a case unresolved for over 4 decades to solved set an important precedent, showing that past dead ends did not mean the file would remain forever unanswered. This impact lay not in statistics, but in how specialized units re-evaluated the value of seemingly exhausted files, encouraging data preservation and readiness to reopen when technology allowed. The role of modern science became particularly prominent here, as genealogical DNA analysis and large-scale data comparison bridged present and past, replacing limitations of traditional investigation reliant on statements and perishable physical evidence. Science did not act as a miracle solving everything, but as a tool enabling confirmation of connections previously invisible, providing the certainty needed for conclusions at legal and historical levels. The investigative significance of solved status in this case thus lay not only in restoring identity to a victim, but in proving truth could be recovered, even when criminal justice could not be completed. It set a new standard for evaluating cold case success, where the goal was not just finding and convicting perpetrators, but clarifying victims' fates and providing authentic answers to those who had waited for years. In this approach, an investigation's value was measured by the completeness of the truth picture, not just courtroom outcomes. Solved status also held symbolic meaning for family and community, officially recognizing the matter was no longer an unsolved mystery, though losses and ethical questions remained. For law enforcement, applying this status reflected maturity in viewing justice's limits and capabilities, acknowledging that for some cases, the greatest success lay in truthfully and responsibly confirming the truth. In a broader context, Matthew Evans' case became evidence of the need for long-term investment in forensic science, data storage and specialized units, as achieved results served not just one file but reshaped system responses to long-term missing persons cases. Solved status thus did not absolutely end the story, but established a meaningful stopping point, where truth was officially recognized, responsibility noted to the extent possible, and the justice system reflected on its role in pursuing justice, even when the path was incomplete. The legally and investigatively established solved status did not end the case's impact, but opened a long phase where subtle consequences continued to ripple through the lives of those involved. Matthew Evans' life after being found did not abruptly change direction, but continued on the foundation built over decades, with his current identity, own family and responsibilities that could not be set aside. Truth confirmation brought clarity to previously mismatched signs, but also placed on Matthew a history he had not directly chosen, requiring careful integration of the restored past into his present life. Decisions about the degree of bonding with his biological family, how to share his personal story, and how much to let the event shape his future were made step by step, reflecting the need to maintain stability, alongside acknowledging origins. For the biological family, knowing Matthew was alive closed a long chapter of waiting, but could not fill the void of 44 years passed in uncertainty. Milestones that should have been shared now existed only as recounted stories, creating a secondary loss where reunion joy coexisted with sorrow over what could not be reclaimed. The 44-year gap was not just a time figure, but a psychological reality, reflecting decisions, relationships, and life trajectories formed in absence, forcing parties to reinterpret personal histories in new light. The case's impact spread to the community, where the story of a child missing for decades and found became a powerful reminder of truth's persistence and human perception's limits at the time of the event. For those who participated in searches or lived in the community when Matthew disappeared, the story of Matthew Evans reminds Americans today that safety is sometimes just a feeling built from habit, like South Carolina in 1960, a small town where everyone knew each other. Kids roamed freely. That very setting made the last witness hesitate before a stranger and overlook a few danger signals, creating the few-minute gap enough for Matthew to vanish. The first lesson is very specific. In today's more crowded modern environments, malls, parks, festivals, schools, treat intuition and the don't hesitate to overreact rule as a protective barrier. If a stranger approaches children and something feels off, act immediately. Move the kids to safety, call security, note descriptions, license plates. Second, the story shows the value of reporting to police early and providing clear data. The Evans family reported right away. Police built a minute-by-minute timeline, cordoned off areas, interviewed witnesses. That's what kept the investigation from drowning in sighting report noise. In America today, prepare in advance. Up-to-date photos of your child, identifying features, description, list of frequent hangouts, and teach kids full name, phone number, stranger rules. Third, the genealogical DNA breakthrough in the story proves technology can pull the past back, but it also imposes responsibility. If using DNA testing, understand data sharing policies, privacy rights, and consequences for the whole family. Finally, the solved but not closed status reminds that justice isn't always complete. Therefore, communities should invest in cold case units, record preservation, and therapy support for victims post-reunion, because finding a missing person is just the start. Living on with the new truth is the longest part. If the story of Matthew Evans makes you believe that truth sometimes needs time, science, and patience to be revealed, subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to follow solved cold cases and rediscovered fates. Thank you for watching to the end. See you in the next video with another case, where past and present intersect in ways no one expected.